The next speaker is Andi Bayer. Andi is a Fairfax County resident who has been following the school board's policies and practices for many years. Alarmed at the onslaught of inappropriate materials appearing in the school curriculum, she is working to raise awareness and take action to remove the harmful and offensive materials. Andi Bayer.
So unfortunately, I might be the most boring speaker today because I'm going to go over the history of how we got to where we are now. So it's essentially the history of sex ed. And how many people would believe that sex education started in the 50s, 40s, 30s? 20s, actually started in 1905.
Wow.
Yeah. So most people are shocked to hear that sex ed was founded in 1905, but then it was under the auspices of the social hygiene movement. And that movement argued even back then that all the social ills that stemmed from sex, meaning unwanted pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, prostitution, and the like, arose not from an evilness of human nature, but from ignorance and the lack of education in this area. So the social hygiene movement was established, and it focused heavily on the medical aspects of sex. And if anything, the teachings only reinforced the pervasive Judeo-Christian culture, including its basic moral and religious values, as it insisted that sexual relations only within the context of marriage were the best prevention methods of both disease, immorality, and unwanted pregnancy. But also during that exact same time, there were people like Jane Addams, who was the founder of the Settlement House movement, and Margaret Sanger, who was a eugenist and a nurse. And sociologists like Maurice Parmelee, who was also a nudist and an author, among many, many others, who were openly exploring and promoting the recreational aspects of sex. And it was their stated goal, and by the way, they all knew each other, to dispel the notion that sex should be harnessed or seen as only useful for childbearing. Rather, they believed sex should be experienced and enjoyed equally by both men and women, without one sex being stigmatized or burdened by ramifications. In fact, Sanger and Parmelee both had such an aversion to sexual abstinence that they insisted it not only caused mental disorders, but maintained that abstaining from sex was a degenerating influence in society, much less the cause of many social inequalities between women and men. Worth noting, it was also during this same time that both access to birth control and the eugenics movement became widely popular in the US. And together, they were widely embraced as basic good breeding practices that would create cultural progress, essentially by discouraging and or limiting the production of children by those deemed to be unfit. So although radical at the time, we now know that it was these influential elements, meaning hygiene, the desire for sexual freedom, sexual gender equality, easy access to birth control, and the goals of eugenics, that the tenets of sex education were born into America's public schools. And to accommodate this new goal of education, there was naturally an accompanying increase in both government funding, government programs, and government intervention into not only our nation's social woes, but also into our schools, families, and religion, and our bedrooms. Essentially, it was fueled by the same old progressive belief that knowledge and information were crucial to mitigating STDs, unwanted pregnancies, gender inequality, and undesirable offspring. And only the government's scientific experts and social hygienists could effectively implement such broad measures of social planning and management. As for the sex education, The goal was to let young people know that sex could be healthy and wholesome, both pleasurable and reproductive. However, sexual restraint was advised and necessary to remain safe and healthy. So here we are in 1912 and in 1914 again, that the National Education Association first passed resolutions calling for the formal adoption of sex education in our schools. But even then, the proponents acknowledged that this undertaking would fail without the broad and complete cooperation from homes, families, religious groups, and community organizations. And not surprisingly, Chicago was to be the first to undergo its implementation, with the chief architect in this experiment being Ella Flagg Young, who was both the first female superintendent of a major urban school system and the first female president of the National Education Association. As well as, she was also a colleague of John Dewey at the University of Chicago. As noted by Young, a perusal of Chicago's curricula would make one conclude that people have no sex organs, and she agreed with social hygienists that ignorance provided the perfect breeding ground for sexual vice. Also in Chicago, prostitution was rampant, and Jane Addams, founder of the Hull House and an active social hygienist, worked with Young and Dewey and the University of Chicago to create a moral and scientific sex education program in the schools, and it encouraged parents and doctors to teach children the basics. But as you might expect, many parents, churches, youth advocacy groups, and elected political officials were not on board, and they had great concern over the content and the fact that the schools were usurping the role that uniquely belonged to parents, and parents were offended that the government hygienists questioned their ability to be their child's sex educators. In the end, Young resigned, the Chicago controversy ended just after one semester, and sex education supporters used Chicago's failures to learn a really good lesson. They needed to fine-tune and create stronger, albeit covert, sex ed programs. And other cities and school districts quietly implemented sex ed programs within their schools without any school board approval or knowledge, and the lessons were integrated into biology, home economics, and other classes. So I can go on and go through and go to Kinsey. I can go on and go into Planned Parenthood. I can go on about the funding of Hugh Hefner. But we now know that there's lots of funding to be had in this arena. And there are hundreds of groups that profit from the generation of tests, the generation of data, the generation of materials, curriculum, and teacher training. And back in the back, I have material about these groups. I also have material and just the amount of policy legislation signed by the Department of Education year after year after year. This is profitable, and these groups aren't going to go away. And the main group behind all of this has been all along Planned Parenthood. So I ask you to go online and look at the Family Life education program that is currently for our public schools. And in just reading through the first couple of pages where it talks about what's necessary for the FLECAC committee, you'll see that the community is not being included. So if you have any questions, I'll be back. And
thank you, Andi.